The Terran defense station orbiting Kepler 442b had been silent for 3 days. Admiral Vextar of the Galactic Dominion Fleet studied the readings on his command display, his 4 eyes narrowing with suspicion. The humans had evacuated their outer colonies without a fight, abandoning strategic positions that had taken them decades to establish. It was unlike them. "Sir, our advanced scouts report the station appears abandoned," reported his tactical officer, a young Zephyrian with scales that flickered nervous blue. "All defensive systems are offline. No energy signatures detected." Vextar's mandibles clicked thoughtfully. In his 200 years of military service, he had learned to fear human unpredictability more than their weapons. The species had a disturbing tendency to do the impossible when cornered, turning certain defeats into Pyrrhic victories that cost the Dominion dearly. "Maintain distance. Launch reconnaissance drones first," he ordered. The massive Dominion dreadnought, 3 kilometers of advanced alien engineering, held position as smaller craft deployed to investigate the seemingly lifeless station. The station itself was a modest structure by galactic standards, a mere 200 meters in diameter. Built from salvaged materials and human stubbornness, it had been a thorn in the Dominion's side for months, disrupting supply lines and coordinating guerrilla attacks across the sector. Intelligence suggested it housed a small garrison of perhaps 30 humans at most. As the drones approached, Vextar reviewed the tactical situation. His fleet consisted of 12 heavy cruisers, 47 frigates, and over 300 support vessels. Nearly 50,000 trained soldiers from a dozen different species, all equipped with weapons that could glass a planet. Against 30 humans hiding in a tin can, the drones transmitted their findings. Empty corridors, darkened command centers, no signs of life. The humans had indeed fled, leaving behind only their obsolete equipment and the lingering smell of their bizarre coffee beverage that seemed to fuel their war efforts. "Sir, there is one anomaly," the sensor operator reported, his tentacles dancing across his console. "A single life form detected in the central hub. Appears to be human, male, elderly by their standards." Vextar studied the readings. 1 human, likely too old or sick to evacuate with the others, left behind to die alone in the cold vacuum of space. It seemed almost cruel, even by human standards. "Probably a caretaker or maintenance worker," his executive officer suggested. "Should we simply destroy the station and move on?" "Our schedule calls for the assault on Earth to begin within the week." The Admiral considered this. The Dominion's final offensive against humanity was already behind schedule. Every day of delay allowed the humans more time to prepare their defenses, more time to create whatever desperate surprises they had planned. One old man wasn't worth the ammunition it would take to destroy the station, but something nagged at him. In all his campaigns against humanity, he had never known them to abandon anyone, especially not the elderly they seemed to revere. Their pack loyalty was legendary, often suicidal. The fact that they would leave someone behind suggested either a breakdown in their famous unity or something else entirely. "Open a communication channel to the station," Vextar decided. Perhaps he could extract some final intelligence from the old human before ending this minor inconvenience. The main screen flickered to life, revealing the interior of the station's command center. Seated in a simple chair before a bank of primitive computers was indeed an elderly human male. His hair was white as stellar ice, his face lined with decades of hard living. He wore a faded military uniform that had seen better years, and his pale blue eyes held a clarity that seemed at odds with his apparent abandonment. "I am Admiral Vextar of the Galactic Dominion Fleet," the Admiral began, his translator rendering his words into the human's crude language. "You are alone and surrounded. Surrender now and you will be treated according to galactic conventions." The old human smiled, and somehow that expression sent an inexplicable chill through the Admiral's exoskeleton. It was not the smile of a defeated man, but of someone who knew something others did not. "Name's Samuel Chen," the human replied, his voice rough with age but steady with purpose. "Sergeant Major, 7th Terran Defense Corps, retired. And I'm afraid I can't surrender, Admiral. You see, someone has to keep the lights on." Vexitar's confusion must have shown on his reptilian features because the old human chuckled, a sound that somehow carried across the vastness of space between them. "Tell me, Admiral," Samuel continued, leaning forward slightly, "in all your years of fighting humans, have you ever wondered why we always seem to have one more trick up our sleeves? Why we never quite break the way the computer models predict we should?" The Admiral's tactical mind raced. This was clearly a delaying tactic, but for what purpose? The station had no weapons capable of threatening his fleet, no defenses that could withstand even a casual bombardment. What could one old man possibly hope to accomplish? Enlighten me, Vextar replied, curious despite himself. Samuel's smile widened and he reached into his jacket pocket, withdrawing something small that glinted in the station's dim lighting. A single bullet, old and tarnished, which he held up to the camera. This belonged to my grandfather, he said quietly. He carried it through 3 wars, always saving it for when it mattered most. Never had to use it, though. Passed it on to my father, who passed it on to me. 4 generations of Chens, 4 generations of soldiers, all waiting for the right moment. The old man stood slowly, his movements deliberate and calm. I think that moment has finally come. Vextar felt something he hadn't experienced in decades of warfare. Not fear exactly, but a profound unease, as if the universe itself was holding its breath. In the background of the transmission, warning lights began to flash on the station's ancient systems, and the Admiral realized with growing alarm that whatever was happening, it had been planned long before his fleet arrived. The last thing he saw before the transmission ended was Samuel Chen loading that single, tarnished bullet into an old projectile weapon, his weathered hand steady as stone, his eyes bright with the terrible purpose of a man who had finally found his moment in history. The silence that followed the severed transmission stretched across Admiral Vextar's bridge like the calm before a solar storm. His crew exchanged uncertain glances, their various alien features reflecting the same confusion that gripped their commander. In 40 years of conquest, Vextar had seen surrender, defiance, desperation, and rage, but he had never seen anything quite like the serene confidence in that old human's eyes. "Sir, should we proceed with bombardment?" his weapons officer asked, her crystalline fingers hovering over the firing controls. The fleet's combined firepower could reduce the station to cosmic dust in seconds. Vextar hesitated. Every instinct screamed that he was missing something crucial. Humans didn't make grand gestures without purpose, and they certainly didn't waste ammunition on meaningless symbolism. That bullet, that ceremony, it had to mean something more than the final act of a broken old soldier. Negative, he decided. Deploy boarding parties. I want to know what we're dealing with before we... Proximity alarms shrieked across the bridge. Every screen flashed red as the fleet's sensors detected massive energy signatures emerging from hyperspace. Vextar spun toward the tactical display, his worst fears materializing before his eyes. Ships, hundreds of them, dropping out of hyperspace in perfect formation around his fleet. But these weren't the crude patchwork vessels he expected from the human resistance. These were sleek, advanced warships bearing designs he didn't recognize, their hulls gleaming with technology that seemed decades ahead of anything in the Dominion arsenal. Unknown vessels. "This is Admiral Vextar of the Galactic Dominion," he broadcast on all frequencies. "You are interfering with lawful Dominion military operations. Identify yourselves immediately." The response came not from the mysterious fleet, but from the Terran defense station. Samuel Chen's weathered face appeared on screen again, but now the background behind him showed banks of sophisticated equipment, humming with power, systems that definitely hadn't been there moments before. "Admiral," Samuel said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had suddenly become far more important than a retired sergeant. "I'd like to introduce you to some friends of ours. Been keeping them secret for quite some time now, waiting for the right moment to make introductions." A new voice cut across the communication channel, speaking in perfect galactic standard but with an accent Vextar couldn't place. "This is Fleet Commander Zarathul of the Terran Protectorate Defense Force. Admiral Vextar, you are hereby ordered to withdraw your forces from this system immediately." Vextar's mind reeled. The Terran Protectorate was supposed to be a minor colonial government, barely capable of maintaining order in their own territory. They had no navy to speak of, no advanced technology, no allies among the major galactic powers. Yet here was a fleet that could match his own in numbers and clearly surpassed it in technology. "This is impossible," his intelligence officer whispered, her mandibles clicking in distress. "Our reports show no indication of such capabilities. No shipyards, no advanced manufacturing, no—" "Your reports," Samuel interrupted, apparently able to hear their bridge communications, "were exactly what we wanted you to see. Did you really think a species that went from wooden sailing ships to spacecraft in less than a century would stop innovating just because you told us to?" The old human stood and walked to what was now clearly a sophisticated command center. His movements no longer those of a feeble retiree, but of a seasoned commander taking his position. You see, Admiral, while you've been busy conquering worlds and demanding tribute, we've been busy making friends. Turns out the galaxy is full of species who don't much like the Dominion's idea of bringing order to the stars. On the tactical display, Vextar watched as more ships materialized. Not just human vessels, but designs he recognized from a dozen different species that the Dominion had written off as conquered, primitive, or extinct. The Corvani supposedly wiped out 3 decades ago, their distinctive bioships pulsing with bioluminescent weapon arrays. The ethereals, the energy beings that had supposedly retreated to another dimension, their crystalline vessels phasing in and out of normal space. Even ships bearing the markings of Dominion member species, their crews apparently having chosen a different side in this conflict. How long? Vextar asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Samuel checked an old-fashioned mechanical watch, the kind humans still insisted on wearing despite having access to quantum chronometers. About 40 years, give or take. Started right around the time your people decided that humanity needed to be brought into compliance. Funny thing about us humans, Admiral. Tell us we can't do something and we get creative. Tell us we can't make friends and we become the most popular species in the local galactic cluster. The fleet displays showed the true scope of what they faced. Over 800 vessels now surrounded Vextar's forces, representing at least 20 different species. Weapons that could crack moons were trained on his ships, and he was receiving dozens of targeting locks from systems he couldn't even identify. This is all very impressive, Vextar admitted, struggling to maintain his composure. But even with these allies, you cannot hope to defeat the full might of the Dominion. This fleet is merely the advance guard. Our main battle groups number in the thousands. Our reserves in the tens of thousands. Samuel nodded thoughtfully, as if considering this point. You're absolutely right, Admiral. In a straight fight, even with all our new friends, we'd probably lose eventually. The Dominion has had 1,000 years to build its war machine. We've had 40. The old human reached into his pocket again, withdrawing that same tarnished bullet. But that's the thing about humans, Admiral. We don't fight straight fights. He walked to a simple projectile weapon mounted on a pedestal in the center of the command room, a device that looked almost ceremonial in its simplicity. As he loaded the single bullet with practiced precision, systems throughout the station began to hum with increasing power. This station, Admiral, isn't just a military outpost. It's a transmitter. And this bullet? He chambered the round and took aim at what appeared to be a simple target at the far end of the room. This bullet carries a message, a very special message that we've been preparing for 4 decades. Vextar's sensors detected massive energy buildups throughout the mysterious fleet, but not weapons charging. Something else, something that made his advanced detection system scream warnings he didn't understand. You see, Samuel continued, his finger moving to the trigger. We humans learned something important about your people in our years of fighting you. Your entire empire depends on instantaneous communication through subspace networks. Every order, every coordination, every piece of information that holds your 1,000 worlds together flows through quantum channels that you've never bothered to properly secure. The Admiral's blood turned to ice as understanding dawned. You wouldn't dare. Samuel's smile was no longer kind. It was the smile of a predator who had been patient for far too long. Admiral, when you decided to wipe out humanity, you made one crucial mistake. You assumed we'd play by your rules. He squeezed the trigger. The ancient projectile weapon fired with a simple mechanical bang that seemed almost absurd in the high-tech environment of the command center. The bullet struck its target, completing a circuit that sent a signal through systems that had been quietly building power for decades. Across the fleet, the Allied ships suddenly blazed with energy as they transmitted something into the quantum substrate of space itself. Not a weapon, but a virus. A carefully crafted piece of malicious code that began propagating through the Dominion's subspace network at faster-than-light speeds, carrying with it the accumulated computer expertise of 20 different species and 40 years of human ingenuity. In the space of heartbeats, that single bullet had triggered the collapse of a galactic empire's communication network, turning their greatest strength into their most critical vulnerability. Samuel set the weapon down gently and looked directly into the camera. Welcome to the revolution, Admiral. The chaos that erupted across Admiral Vextar's fleet was unlike anything in recorded military history. Within minutes of Samuel's shot, every Dominion vessel found itself cut off from the vast communication network that had coordinated their empire for over a millennium. Ships that had operated as a unified force suddenly became isolated islands of confusion, their crews struggling to comprehend what had just happened. "Sir, we've lost contact with High Command," his communications officer reported, panic creeping into her normally steady voice. "Subspace networks are completely down. I'm not even getting carrier signals from our own fleet." Vextar watched his tactical display dissolve into chaos as ship after ship reported the same catastrophic failure. Without their quantum communication systems, his forces couldn't coordinate attacks, share sensor data, or even maintain basic formation. 40 years of technological dependence had just become their greatest weakness. Meanwhile, the mysterious Allied fleet moved with perfect precision, their ships communicating through methods that apparently didn't rely on the compromised networks. They began repositioning around the Dominion forces like pieces on a cosmic chessboard, not attacking yet, but making it clear who now controlled the battlefield. "How is this possible?" Vextar demanded. "Our quantum encryption was supposed to be unbreakable." Samuel's voice came through on what appeared to be a simple radio transmission, the kind of primitive communication the Dominion had abandoned centuries ago. "That's the problem with thinking you're the smartest species in the galaxy, Admiral. You get lazy. Your encryption was indeed unbreakable by any single species. But when 20 different civilizations spend 4 decades working together, sharing their unique perspectives on quantum mechanics, it turns out your perfect system has some pretty obvious flaws." The old human moved through his command center with increasing energy, no longer the abandoned caretaker, but clearly the central coordinator of an operation that spanned star systems. "While your people were busy conquering and demanding tribute, we were busy learning. Every species you defeated had something to teach us. The Corvani understood biological computing in ways your artificial intelligence never could. The ethereals showed us how consciousness itself could be used as a programming language. Even the insectoid hive minds contributed distributed processing techniques that your individualistic programmers never considered." Through the main viewer, Vextar could see the results of this unprecedented cooperation. Corvani bioships were interfacing directly with ethereal crystal vessels, their living computers sharing data with energy beings in real time. Human ships equipped with technology that seamlessly blended dozens of different scientific philosophies worked alongside craft that shouldn't have been able to coexist in the same space. "This is all very impressive," Vextar said, struggling to maintain his authority in the face of the impossible. "But you've only disabled our communications. Our weapons still function, our ships are still operational. We can still fight." Samuel chuckled, the sound somehow carrying more menace than any battle cry. "Can you, Admiral? Tell me how many of your crew members are from conquered species? How many Zephyrians, Corvani, Nixari, and others serve aboard your ships? Because they had no choice but to join the Dominion military." The Admiral's heart sank as he understood the implication. His fleet wasn't just technologically compromised, it was politically unstable. Across the galaxy, the Dominion military relied heavily on conscripts and volunteers from subjugated worlds. Without central command to maintain discipline, and with clear evidence that their empire was not as invincible as they'd been led to believe, how long would those crews remain loyal? His fears were confirmed as reports began flooding in from across the fleet. Mutinies were breaking out on dozens of ships as non-Dominion crew members seized control of critical systems. The carefully maintained unity of his forces was dissolving in real time. "You planned this," Vextar realized. "The evacuation, the abandoned station, even me being here. All of it was orchestrated," Samuel nodded approvingly. "Now you're beginning to understand. We needed your fleet here intact and in one piece for what comes next. Destroying you would have just made you martyrs and taught the Dominion to be more careful. But turning you, converting an entire battle group to our cause, that sends a message that will spread to every corner of the galaxy." The Admiral watched helplessly as more of his ships reported successful mutinies. The crews weren't destroying the vessels, but were instead offering to join the growing rebellion. It was a nightmare scenario that no Dominion military doctrine had prepared for. "What do you want?" Vextar asked finally. Samuel walked to a new console that had risen from the floor, his hands moving across controls that seemed to blend technology from multiple species into a unified interface. "What we've always wanted, Admiral. To be left alone. To explore the stars, make friends, learn new things, and build something beautiful instead of just conquering and consuming. The main screen shifted to show images from across the galaxy. Dominion communications networks flickering and failing on world after world. Rebellion erupting on planets that had been peaceful for decades. The careful order that had held the Empire together for 1,000 years cracking under the weight of its own oppression, now that the oppressed could suddenly coordinate their resistance. But mostly, Samuel continued, his weathered hand resting on the simple projectile weapon that had started it all. We want to teach the galaxy that humans keep their promises. We promised that if you came for Earth, you'd regret it. Well, Admiral, here's your regret. Through the chaos of reports and system failures, Vextar began to see the true scope of what had been unleashed. This wasn't just a military defeat or even a successful rebellion. This was the carefully planned collapse of an entire galactic order, orchestrated by a species that the Dominion had underestimated in every possible way. The old human picked up his antique bullet casing, examining it with obvious satisfaction. My grandfather always said this bullet would change history when the time was right. I don't think even he imagined it would bring down an empire. As if summoned by those words, Fleet Commander Zarathul's voice cut through the communication channel. Admiral Vextar, my sensors indicate that approximately 60% of your vessels have already joined our coalition. I'm prepared to accept the surrender of the remainder, along with yourself and your command staff. You'll be treated according to galactic conventions and returned to Dominion space once this conflict is resolved. Vextar looked around his bridge at the faces of his remaining loyal crew. Fear, confusion, and growing desperation reflected in their alien features. They had come here expecting to crush the last organized human resistance before moving on to Earth itself. Instead, they had walked into a trap 40 years in the making, sprung by an old soldier with a family heirloom and the combined ingenuity of 20 species united by their refusal to accept Dominion rule. The Admiral realized that his choice wasn't really whether to surrender or fight. It was whether to be remembered as the commander who recognized when he was beaten, or as the fool who threw away lives for a cause that was already lost. Samuel Chen stood waiting patiently, no longer the abandoned old man but revealed as the architect of the most successful military deception in galactic history. In his lined face, Vextar saw the accumulated patience of a species that had learned to think in decades rather than moments, to plan for victories that might not come until after the planners themselves were gone. It was the most human thing imaginable, and the most terrifying. Admiral Vextar stood in the center of his bridge, surrounded by the wreckage of everything he had believed about galactic power. The decision before him should have been simple for a warrior of his stature, but nothing about this situation followed the rules he had lived by for 2 centuries. Surrender meant acknowledging that everything the Dominion had taught about human weakness was wrong. Fighting meant sending thousands of soldiers to die for a cause that was already lost. Admiral, Samuel's voice carried across the communication channel with surprising gentleness. I know this is difficult. Your empire has told you for generations that might makes right, that advanced technology guarantees victory, that superior firepower can solve any problem. But look around you. Look at what we've built. The main screen showed the coalition fleet in all its impossible glory. Ships that should have been enemies working in perfect harmony. Species that had supposedly been wiped out standing proudly alongside those thought too primitive to matter. It was a demonstration of cooperation that challenged everything the Dominion represented. How long have you known? Vextar asked quietly. How long have you been planning this specific moment? Samuel checked his old-fashioned watch again, a gesture that had become oddly comforting in its consistency since the day your scouts first appeared in our system. We knew you'd come eventually. Knew you'd bring a fleet large enough to feel confident but small enough to be manageable. We just had to be patient. The Admiral's tactical mind began to grasp the true scope of the deception. The resistance activities, the guerrilla attacks, even our intelligence reports about human capabilities. All of it was designed to bring us here. Every single operation was calculated to make you believe exactly what you wanted to believe. Samuel confirmed that humans were desperate, disorganized, and on the verge of collapse. We fed your intelligence networks information that painted us as barely holding together, always one step away from complete defeat. A new voice joined the conversation, speaking in the clicking language of the Corvani. Before the translator kicked in, the Dominion makes the same mistake with every species they encounter. They see what they expect to see, hear what they want to hear, It never occurs to them that their subjects might be more clever than their masters. Vextar recognized the voice as belonging to High Nest Mother Crixtal, supposedly executed 30 years ago during the Corvani subjugation, yet here she was, commanding a fleet of bioships that had apparently been growing in secret for decades. "You're supposed to be dead," the Admiral said. Her chittering laughter filled the bridge. "According to Dominion records, my entire species is extinct. Yet here we are, very much alive and very interested in discussing the future of galactic governance with our human friends." One by one, other voices joined the communication channel. The ethereal collective consciousness spoke in harmonized tones that bypassed the translator entirely, communicating concepts directly into the minds of everyone present. Gas giant dwellers whose existence the Dominion had never even discovered shared their perspective through chemical emissions that the ship's atmosphere processors interpreted as words. Ancient machine intelligences that had been dismissed as defunct stellar maintenance systems revealed they had been watching and learning for millennia. Samuel gestured to his communications array, which was now clearly serving as a hub for this impossible gathering. "This is what we've been building, Admiral. Not just a military alliance, but a true coalition of species working together because they choose to, not because they're forced to." The contrast couldn't have been more stark. The Dominion fleet, now fragmented and confused, represented 1,000 years of conquest and forced submission. The coalition fleet represented 40 years of patient diplomacy, mutual respect, and shared purpose. "Your empire will send more fleets," Vextar pointed out, grasping for some strategic advantage. "Larger ones. The Dominion has the resources to build 1,000 fleets like mine." "Yes," Samuel agreed, "and every one of them will face the same problem you're facing now. They'll be isolated, unable to communicate with each other or with their command structure, surrounded by enemies they didn't know existed, and dependent on crews that have every reason to question their loyalty." The old human brought up a holographic display, showing the galaxy-wide effects of the quantum virus they had unleashed. Communication networks were failing across hundreds of star systems. Rebellion was erupting on worlds that had been peaceful for decades. The Dominion's greatest strength, its unified command structure, had become its critical weakness. But more importantly, Samuel continued, "Every ship they send gives us more opportunities to convert their crews, to show them what voluntary cooperation looks like instead of forced submission. Your species isn't evil, Admiral. They're just trapped in a system that mistakes fear for respect and conquest for achievement." Through the viewport, Vextar could see some of his own ships already beginning to integrate with the coalition fleet. Dominion vessels were docking with human ships, their crews apparently engaging in peaceful exchanges that would have been unthinkable hours earlier. "This is all very idealistic," the Admiral said, "but how do you expect to govern a galaxy? The Dominion provides order, stability, protection from chaos. What happens when this revolution of yours succeeds? How do you prevent everything from falling apart?" Samuel's weathered face crinkled into what might have been the first genuinely amused expression Vextar had seen from him. "Admiral, you're thinking like a Dominion commander. You're assuming that governance means control, that stability requires subjugation, that order must be imposed from above." The old human walked to a window overlooking the coalition fleet. "Look out there. See how different species are already working together without anyone forcing them to? The ethereals are sharing consciousness techniques with human telepaths. The Corvani are teaching our engineers biological computing principles. The machine intelligences are helping everyone optimize their energy systems." He turned back to face the camera, and Vextar saw something in those pale blue eyes that he had never seen before in all his years of conquest. Not the desperate defiance of the defeated, not the grim determination of the outnumbered, but the quiet confidence of someone who had already won by changing the rules of the game. "We're not planning to govern the galaxy, Admiral. We're planning to teach it how to govern itself." The communication channel filled with agreement from dozens of species as Samuel's words were translated into languages, thought patterns, and communication methods that spanned the known galaxy. This wasn't just a military victory or a successful rebellion. It was the birth of something entirely new in galactic history. Vextar realized that his choice was no longer whether to surrender or fight. It was whether to cling to a dying system or help birth something unprecedented. The old human with his antique bullet had not just defeated a fleet. He had made it possible for an entire galaxy to imagine a different way of existing together. The weight of 2 centuries of military conditioning warred with the evidence before his eyes. Everything he had been taught about power, about order, about the natural hierarchy of species was crumbling around him. And in its place was rising something that logic said should be impossible, but that was demonstrably working. The silence that filled Admiral Vexitar's bridge stretched longer than the space between stars. Around him, his remaining crew waited for the order that would define not just their fate, but their place in the new galactic order being born before their eyes. The Admiral's 4 hearts beat different rhythms as he processed the magnitude of what Samuel Chen and his coalition had accomplished. "I need to know," Vextar said finally, his voice carrying the weight of centuries of military doctrine crumbling in real time. "This bullet, this moment, this entire operation, was any of it actually dependent on you firing that weapon, or was it all symbolic?" Samuel's weathered face broke into a genuinely warm smile, the kind reserved for a student who had asked exactly the right question. "Now that's the question of a true strategist, Admiral. The honest answer is both. The bullet itself was purely symbolic, a signal to activate systems that had been in place for years, but the symbolism mattered just as much as the technology. The old human picked up the spent brass casing, rolling it between his fingers like a talisman. Every species in this coalition needed to see that humans were willing to take decisive action at the crucial moment. They needed to know that when we made a promise, we kept it. My grandfather's bullet became the symbol of human commitment that sealed 40 years of diplomatic work." He gestured to the coalition fleet, where ships that shouldn't have been able to coexist were working in perfect harmony. Each species contributed something unique to this moment. The ethereals provided the consciousness-based programming that made the quantum virus possible. The Corvani grew the biological computers that could process information faster than any artificial system. The machine intelligences calculated the precise timing needed to synchronize everything across multiple star systems. Admiral Vextar studied the tactical displays showing the scope of the galactic transformation. Dominion communication networks continued to fail in cascading waves across their territory. Entire sectors were going dark as local commanders found themselves cut off from central authority. But instead of chaos, reports were coming in of peaceful transitions as coalition representatives arrived to help coordinate new governmental structures. "How many other fleets like mine have you planned for?" the Admiral asked. Samuel consulted a data pad that seamlessly integrated human interface design with alien technology. 17 major battle groups are currently en route to various targets throughout human space. Each one will find a different version of what you've encountered here. Some will face overwhelming military force from our coalition allies. Others will discover that their target systems are empty, their objectives moved or evacuated. A few will find themselves welcomed as liberators by populations that have been secretly preparing for rebellion for decades. The scope of the planning was staggering. While the Dominion had been preparing for a final assault on humanity, humanity had been preparing to transform the galaxy. But the real genius, added High Nest Mother Krikstal through the communication array, was realizing that the Dominion's greatest strength could become its greatest weakness. Your empire's reliance on instant communication and centralized control meant that disrupting those systems would create chaos throughout your territory. An ethereal voice joined the conversation, speaking directly to their minds rather than through the translator. "The consciousness viral hybrid we created doesn't just disrupt communication networks. It learns and adapts, spreading through any quantum-entangled system it encounters. By now it has reached the Dominion capital itself." Vextar's minds raced with the implications. If the Central Worlds were experiencing the same communication failures as his fleet, then the Empire was effectively paralyzed. Local commanders would be forced to make independent decisions without guidance from above, and 40 years of growing resentment among subjugated populations would inevitably explode into open rebellion. "You've triggered a galactic revolution," he realized. "We've created the opportunity for one," Samuel corrected. "Each world, each system, each species will choose their own path forward. Some may try to maintain local versions of Dominion control. Others will experiment with forms of government that haven't been seen for millennia. The beauty of it is that no one is being forced to accept our vision. We're simply making it possible for others to pursue their own." Through the viewports, Vextar could see the immediate results of this philosophy in action. His own ships were engaging in peaceful exchanges with coalition vessels, their crews learning about alternatives to the hierarchical structures they had known all their lives. No one was being coerced or threatened. They were simply being offered choices they had never known existed. "What about Earth?" the Admiral asked. "Your homeworld was supposed to be the primary target of our campaign. What happens now?" Samuel's expression grew thoughtful, and for a moment he looked every year of his considerable age. "Earth will be what it has always been to humans, Admiral. Home. But it won't be the center of a new empire or the capital of a galactic government. It will be one world among many, contributing what it can to the larger community of species." He activated a new display showing Earth in all its blue and green glory. "We learned something important from studying the Dominion's mistakes. Centralized power, even with the best intentions, eventually corrupts itself. Better to have many centers of innovation, cooperation, and growth spread throughout the galaxy." Fleet Commander Zarathul's voice cut through the discussion with practical matters. "Admiral Vextar, I'm receiving surrender requests from the last of your vessels that haven't already joined us voluntarily. Your tactical position is untenable, and continued resistance would only result in unnecessary casualties." Vextar looked around his bridge one final time, seeing his crew with new eyes. Most of them weren't even Dominion citizens by birth, but conscripts from conquered worlds who had served because they had no choice. How many of them had dreamed of this moment without daring to hope it might come? "What happens to me?" he asked. "What happens to career Dominion officers who have spent their lives enforcing the old system?" Samuel considered the question seriously. "That depends on what you choose to do next, Admiral. The galaxy will need experienced leaders who understand large-scale organization and logistics. The question is whether you want to use those skills to help build something new, or to try to preserve something that no longer exists." The old human set down the bullet casing and fixed Vextar with a steady gaze. "I won't lie to you. There will be trials for war criminals, justice for those who committed atrocities under Dominion authority, but there will also be opportunities for redemption, chances to help repair the damage that's been done to countless worlds and species." Vextar realized that this was what true victory looked like, not the crushing of enemies, but their transformation into allies, not the imposition of a new order, but the creation of conditions where multiple orders could coexist and thrive. The Admiral of the Galactic Dominion Fleet straightened his uniform one last time, then reached for his command codes. The decision he was about to make would echo through history as the moment when the old galaxy died and a new one was born. "Fleet Commander Zarathul," he said formally, "I am prepared to discuss terms of surrender for all remaining Dominion vessels under my command." As he spoke the words, Vextar felt something he hadn't experienced in decades of military service: hope for a future that might be better than the past. 3 months after the Battle of Kepler 442b, as historians would come to call it, Samuel Chen sat in the same chair where he had faced down the Galactic Dominion fleet. The difference was that now the Terran Defense Station had been transformed into something unprecedented. The galaxy's first cooperative coordination center, where representatives from over 300 species worked together to help manage the transition from Empire to Alliance. The old soldier no longer wore his faded military uniform but simple civilian clothes that reflected his new role as an advisor and coordinator rather than a commander. The antique projectile weapon remained on its pedestal, but now it was surrounded by gifts from grateful species across the galaxy. Crystalline formations from the ethereals, biosculptures from the Corvani, quantum computation matrices from the machine intelligences, and dozens of other tokens representing the galaxy's growing diversity of cooperation. "How does it feel?" asked the young human reporter interviewing him. "To know that a single bullet fired by a retired soldier brought down a 1,000-year-old empire." Samuel chuckled. The same warm sound that had somehow managed to terrify Admiral Vextar months earlier. "That's not quite accurate, Sarah. The bullet was just a symbol. What brought down the Dominion was 40 years of patient work by thousands of species who refused to accept that conquest was the natural order of things." Through the station's expanded viewports, they could see the results of that work. The space around the former defense station now hosted a permanent fleet of ships from dozens of species, not as a military force but as a mobile diplomatic corps. Former Dominion vessels worked alongside coalition ships in rescue operations, helping evacuate worlds that wanted to abandon their industrial infrastructure in favor of more sustainable development paths. "What happened to Admiral Vextar?" the reporter asked, consulting her notes. "Our sources indicate he's still in the system." Samuel nodded toward a section of the station visible through the transparent aluminum. "He's right over there, actually. Turns out he has a remarkable talent for logistics and organizational management when he's working for voluntary cooperation instead of forced compliance. He's been instrumental in helping coordinate the peaceful transition on over 40 former Dominion worlds." The transformation of the galaxy had proceeded far more smoothly than anyone had dared hope. When centralized authority collapsed, most worlds had chosen to experiment with local governance rather than descend into chaos. The Coalition's policy of offering assistance without demanding compliance had proven far more effective than the Dominion's iron fist approach. "There have been some conflicts," Samuel acknowledged when asked about the transition's challenges. "A few systems have tried to establish local dictatorships, and there are still pockets of die-hard Dominion loyalists who refuse to accept the new reality. But they're increasingly isolated as more species discover the benefits of voluntary cooperation." He activated a holographic display showing the current state of galactic civilization. Instead of the rigid hierarchical structure that had characterized Dominion space, the galaxy now showed a complex web of interconnected but independent communities. Trade routes had expanded exponentially as species no longer had to pay tribute to central authority. Scientific advancement had accelerated as researchers freely shared discoveries across cultural boundaries. Even art and literature were experiencing a renaissance as suppressed cultures rediscovered their unique voices. "The most surprising development," Samuel continued, "has been the emergence of hybrid communities, worlds where multiple species are choosing to live together and develop combined technologies and cultures. It's something the Dominion never would have permitted, but it's producing innovations we never could have imagined." The reporter's next question was inevitable. What's next for humanity? Some critics argue that humans have simply replaced the Dominion as the dominant galactic power. Samuel's expression grew serious. "That would be the worst possible outcome, and we're taking specific steps to prevent it. Earth is deliberately limiting its political influence and focusing on contributing to the galactic community, rather than leading it. We've learned from the Dominion's mistakes about the corrupting nature of centralized power." He gestured toward the diverse array of beings working throughout the station. "Humans are good at certain things. Long-term planning, building coalitions, adapting to changing circumstances. But we're terrible at others. The ethereals understand consciousness in ways we never will. The Corvani grasp biological systems that are beyond our comprehension. The machine intelligences process information on scales we can't match. The galaxy is better when everyone contributes their strengths." A soft chime indicated an incoming priority communication. Samuel activated the channel to reveal the familiar face of Highnest Mother Crickstal, though she now spoke from the bridge of a Corvani bioship that was conducting scientific research rather than military operations. "Samuel," she said in her clicking language, "we've received a response from the Andromeda delegation. They're interested in establishing formal contact with our coalition." The implications were staggering. Contact with extragalactic civilizations had been the stuff of theoretical speculation for millennia. Now it was becoming reality as the galaxy's new openness and cooperation drew attention from neighbors who had previously avoided contact with what they perceived as a warlike and aggressive civilization, humanity's real gift to the galaxy. Samuel explained to the reporter after ending the call, "Wasn't military prowess or technological innovation. It was the idea that different species could work together as equals instead of existing in a hierarchy of conquest and submission." He walked to the memorial wall that had been added to the station, displaying the names of beings from hundreds of species who had died under Dominion rule, but whose sacrifice had made the current peace possible. My grandfather's bullet represented something important, the willingness to take decisive action when the moment demanded it. But the real victory was won by diplomats and scientists and ordinary citizens who chose cooperation over competition, understanding over conquest. The interview concluded with Samuel standing before the viewport, looking out at a galaxy transformed. Ships moved freely between worlds without fear of Dominion interference. Science stations shared research across species boundaries. Cultural exchange programs allowed beings to experience ways of life their ancestors could never have imagined. People sometimes ask me if I regret spending my entire life Preparing for a war that lasted only a few hours, he said quietly. But I don't see it that way. We weren't preparing for war. We were preparing for peace. And that's something worth dedicating a lifetime to achieve. In the months and years that followed, the legend of the old human who faced down a galactic fleet with a single bullet would spread throughout the known galaxy and beyond. But Samuel Chen knew that the real story wasn't about one moment of decisive action. It was about the patient work of countless beings who chose to believe that the universe could be better than it was, and who were willing to spend decades making that belief a reality. The bullet itself remained on display in the Cooperative Coordination Center, not as a weapon of war, but as a symbol of the moment when the galaxy chose hope over fear, cooperation over conquest, and the promise of a shared future over the weight of the oppressive past. And in the vast expanse of space where thousands of species now work together toward common goals, that single piece of tarnished metal served as a reminder that sometimes the smallest actions could reshape the destiny of entire civilizations.